Hey guys, today I want to talk about another networking topic, and this one is dealing with network segmentation for the purpose of network security. Now, I'm going to approach this with the assumption that you as a viewer have very little knowledge about how to do networking, or maybe just a little bit, and you're kind of interested in this topic, mostly because you maybe saw my headline or you're trying to figure out how to better improve your network security. Well, this one is going to approach it from that assumption to show you some very easy ways that you can create network segmentation on your home network or your office network that will improve your security posture. And these things are very easy to implement with most consumer grade networking gear, but you can also do this with commercial gear as well. But I'm going to talk about it from that level. So don't expect a deep dive into other strategies, which I'll probably do videos on that in the future, which are definitely going to be more technical in their depth. But this one is going to be talking more at the strategic level, talk about why you want to do this and offer some advice on the categories which you would use in your segmentation, and just some real easy strategies for doing this with stuff that you might already have. So the use case for segmentation has a lot to do with security, but it's not so much about somebody hacking into your wireless router that you have on your network. Rather, it's about somebody getting access to a device behind your wireless router. And by accessing that device behind your wireless router, they can have unfettered access to other things on your network. So they can scan for vulnerabilities on maybe your PC or your phone. They're able to access files or printers or things on your phone or whatever it might be that you don't want them accessing because they have access to a compromised device on your network. So with that in mind, it's good to separate devices from one another depending on what kind of devices they are. So I like to think of this in at least two broad categories, and those categories would be what I think of as what I call trusted devices, and then with a separation from untrusted devices. So trusted devices would be devices that you typically have to log into, something that you're required to put in a password or some kind of PIN number, or do some kind of facial recognition, or maybe it's a thumbprint, or it's something that secures that device and that requires the user to put in some kind of credential into that device to access the data on that device. And so that might be something like your laptop. It could be a phone or a tablet. It could even be something like a gaming console or like a Nintendo Switch or some device like that. And the reason why you log into those devices is because typically a device like this is going to have a lot more sensitive data on it than some other kinds of devices. And these devices are also security hardened because of that. And so they put a lot of time and effort into making sure that the files and data are secured on the device and stored in a way that requires a person to first authenticate before accessing the data. And so the security model is very secure on these devices. On this other side over here for untrusted devices, you're talking about things that perform a function, a singular function. So that might be like a smart speaker, or a security camera, maybe a refrigerator, or even a television. These are devices that primarily do a single type of thing, whatever that might be. So a speaker plays music or audiobooks. A security camera is basically there to watch for things happening in a particular area in your home or outside. A refrigerator obviously cools off your food and keeps it from spoiling, and a TV obviously plays back media. But they're not really intended for storing sensitive data on. So they don't put a lot of effort into making these devices really, really secure. So the passwords and other kinds of credentials that are stored on these devices usually aren't going to be something that are going to compromise a ton of data. And so they don't put a lot of effort into attempting to store those in a secure way. So if someone was to access maybe my TV and compromise that device, at most they're probably going to get a Disney Plus password or something like that. Okay, so I can mitigate against that at some level by changing my password, but it's not going to get access to like my email or my bank account information or anything like that. That's going to be a lot more sensitive, which might be something I have on a phone, tablet, or a PC, and to a lesser degree on a gaming console. The reason I put those on there is sometimes people use those for internet browsing and that kind of thing, so it can have sensitive data on them. But these devices down here on the bottom on this untrusted side aren't typically going to do those kinds of things. So it's wise to separate them out because they have a more relaxed security model. They're more of a potential threat because they're easier to compromise. And then if they are compromised, if they're not segmented, it means that somebody could attempt to brute force their way into some of these other devices. And so if you segment them out by putting a barrier between them, that allows you to prevent those kinds of activities from happening. And so at worst case scenarios, if they're segmented, maybe they can access your TV or your security camera, but they're not going to get any real sensitive data by trying to access phones, tablets, or whatever the device may be that's in the more trusted zone. So one of the easiest ways to do this is take advantage of one of the common features available on a router, and that's the guest mode. And it's a fairly common feature on most all routers nowadays. And what that guest mode does is basically just sets up a separate wireless network for guests that come over to your house. But you're not going to have guests over at your house continuously. Maybe you do, but most of the time people don't do that. Rather, what you can use that for instead is an untrusted network, just a general purpose untrusted network. And you could put all your untrusted devices then out here on that untrusted network. That would be where I would put things like smart speakers and smart bulbs and security cameras and televisions and refrigerators, so that they're separated from a more trusted network that's more your network for things like PCs and tablets and phones and those kinds of devices that have that more sensitive data on them. So another scheme that I prefer more than the previous scheme of just that simple trusted, untrusted scheme is to use something that looks like this, where you have a trusted scheme, and that's pretty much the same as the one before, but you further subdivide that untrusted zone into two other categories. One is truly for guest access, and that's for people that come over to your house that want to connect to the internet, and you provide them guest level access, and you set your device up to do that. And another one is to create an IoT network. Now, IoT is a class of devices that are those kinds of things that I talked about, devices that perform more or less a single function. So a smart speaker would be one example of that. Of course, a security camera. A television, it's not a single function device, but it kind of fits into the category of IoT. And then, of course, appliances would be certainly in that category. So anything like a refrigerator that has some kind of internet connectivity, maybe it's a smart bulb or a smart outlet or maybe a doorbell camera, whatever it might be. All of those are what we call IoT devices. And this network right here, I would definitely segment in a way that does not have access to anything other than the internet for reporting telemetry or accessing this with an app or whatever it might be, because these kinds of devices, like I said, are typically not secured very well. They're actually pretty lax in the security for the most part. And so if there anything on your network is going to be compromised, it's probably going to be one of those. In fact, I wrote a whole book about IoT devices called Architecting IoT Solutions on Microsoft Azure. And if anybody has been following me for a while knows that I'm passionate about Azure. And a big section of this book just talks about security and all of the different kinds of aspects that go into securing devices. That chapter alone would probably be enough to make you paranoid about putting anything IoT on a network that has trusted devices in it. So for that reason, I would recommend using some scheme like this that's got a 3-class division rather than a single 2-class division. And that way, these devices are also separated from your guests that might get on your network as well. And you're providing your guests with a level of protection from those IoT devices, just like you're providing your own devices a level of protection by excluding those IoT devices from your network as well. So if your router access point provides you with the ability to add more than 2 networks, you can add a third one for IoT, for instance, then just set up the third network for IoT and you're good to go. But most networking devices that are consumer oriented only provide that guest mode network and then your more trusted network. So if that's the case, what you can do then is actually daisy chain a couple of these together, and it's really not hard to do. So what you would do in this case is set up a primary access point that basically creates a more loosely configured network for those guests that you might have logging onto your network, and as well as your IoT devices. And so you put those segmentations in place, and then they can access the internet. And then what you would do is you would take an Ethernet cable from a second access point router down here and plug it into its internet port, but then you would plug it into the upstream LAN port, and that will basically just share the internet connection from this internet port up here to the LAN port, and then from the LAN port it would come back into this one's internet port, and then it would then rebroadcast that internet connection to all of your devices that are on the second access point down here. And then you can create a trusted network, and that trusted network is insulated from the IoT network and the guest network by way of the fact that it is treating those like they're on the internet. This access point down here is. And so it's essentially isolated behind the second access point, while those other devices are kind of out there in what's kind of like what we might call a DMZ, if you will. It's not exactly on the internet, but it's in a more loosely configured, less secure environment, which is fine for for those kinds of devices. But this one is a lot more insulated because it's kind of 2 layers removed from the actual internet. So it's a lot harder to get into and a lot harder to compromise because of that. So for a 3 network configuration, this would certainly work. So I want to talk about something else that involves 4 networks now. So a 4 network setup might look something like this, where you have a work network and then you have the other 3 that we already saw. Now this work network is for folks that work from home on a pretty regular basis, like I do. I work from home exclusively. I've been working from home for a number of years now. So having a separate network for work purposes is conducive for the equipment that my employer provides me. And it just provides me a layer of isolation from my own devices accessing data that might be sensitive on my work devices, and vice versa. If one of these work devices were to get compromised, it would prevent them from accessing my personal stuff that's sitting over here. And so it provides a nice layer of separation whenever we're talking about these 2 different domains. Now, if you don't work from home, it's probably not going to lend you a lot of benefit, but in any case, it's just one of those things that I like to do to have that extra layer of separation. And the way you can set this up is, again, pretty much just like we saw a minute ago. If you can add a 4th network to a single device, then do that. It's easier to do, but you can also use the daisy chain approach, where you have a primary device that connects to the internet and then provides a wireless network for your guests and your IoT network. And then you daisy chain a second wireless access point router down here. It plugs into the LAN up here and it plugs in the internet port down here. And then you use the 2 networks available on that second device, one for your trusted and then one for your work. And that way you have 4 networks using a setup that looks similar to this. All that to say is it provides you with segmentation. The name of the game here is simplicity and segmentation for the purpose of security. Now, I'm going to do some other videos where I'm going to do deeper, more technical dives into other ways that you can do this. And the way that I typically do it at home is using more advanced networking concepts. But if that's not your gig, then something like this is absolutely legitimate and it absolutely works, because I actually did it this way for years before I upgraded all my gear to something that's more commercially oriented and less consumer oriented. But still, using consumer gear, you can get good network segmentation without having to sink a lot of money into commercial gear that gives you advanced features that you probably don't need, when you can do it easily with 2 networking devices and a little bit of configuration. So all this to say is, yes, implement network segmentation for the purposes of security and you won't regret it. In any case, if you like this content, please do subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with your friends, drop me a comment in the comment section down below, and do all that good stuff. I'll gladly interact with you on this kinds of stuff. And if you have any questions about this, I can gladly entertain those. I always like to interact with the viewers. And as always, thanks for watching.
If you like this content, please consider subscribing to the channel by clicking on the subscribe button. You can also like this content by clicking on the thumbs up, or share this content with your friends, and also comment in the comment section down below. You can also find me online at www.blaze.net or on Twitter at @TheOneMule. And as always, thanks for watching.